The chain of gold. The frigid night air carried the sharp tang of winter as Marcus Big Shaq Duval strolled down a quiet London street. The city, usually humming with life even in the late hours, was unusually serene, a perfect moment for reflection. Shaq had just wrapped up a triumphant concert at one of London's most prestigious venues. The crowd had been electric, the kind of audience every artist dreamed of, and he felt the lingering buzz of adrenaline coursing through his veins. In one hand, he clutched a steaming cup of tea, its warmth seeping through the styrofoam and into his fingers. Around his neck, a thick gold chain gleamed under the dim glow of the streetlights. This chain wasn't just jewelry, it was a testament to his journey, a heavy, brilliant reminder of how far he had come. From the concrete jungles of his youth, the stages that shone under the glare of a million lights, Shaq had fought for every ounce of success. The chain symbolized triumph over adversity. The street was silent save for the occasional sound of distant traffic. Shaq relished this quiet as he walked, his breath visible in the cold air. His hoodie was pulled over his head, the thick material doing little to shield him from the bite of the night. Still, he didn't mind. He had endured colder nights with far heavier burdens. Suddenly, a flash of light disrupted his thoughts. Headlights rounded the corner, the piercing beams slicing through the darkness like knives. Shaq's calm evaporated as the car slowed to a crawl, its tires crunching on the pavement. His instincts, honed from years of navigating a world where survival wasn't guaranteed, told him this wasn't good. The car stopped abruptly, the sound of brakes slicing through the stillness. A police patrol car. The door creaked open, and a man stepped out. His uniform was rumpled, his belt heavy with tools of authority, and his face bore a scowl that radiated disdain. Officer Carter, a veteran of the force, had seen men like Shaq before, or at least he thought he had. To him, Marcus wasn't an artist or a successful man. He was just another young black man walking the streets late at night, his wealth suspicious and his presence inconvenient. "Oi, you there?" Carter barked, his voice laced with an arrogance born from years of unchecked authority. He approached Shaq with slow, deliberate steps, his hand resting on his belt. "What are you doing out here at this hour?" Shaq stopped in his tracks. He turned his head slowly, meeting the officer's gaze. "Just heading home, sir," he replied, his voice calm but firm. His tone was measured, carefully stripped of the anger bubbling beneath the surface. He had learned long ago that anger, no matter how justified, would only make things worse. Carter smirked, looking Shaq up and down. His eyes lingered on the chain, its brilliance seemingly offensive to him. "Heading home, eh? Or maybe you've been up to no good." He tilted his head, his smirk widening into a grin filled with venom. "That's quite the chain you've got there. Looks expensive." "It is," Shaq replied, his tone steady. "I earned it." "Earned it?" Carter snorted, taking another step closer. His eyes flicked to Shaq's sneakers, pristine and high-end. "Men like you don't earn things like this. You steal them, sell a bit of dope, maybe rough someone up in a dark alley." Shaq's jaw tightened, but he refused to rise to the bait. "I'm an artist," he said simply. "An artist?" Carter laughed, the sound cruel and mocking. "In your neighborhood, artist is just another word for hustler." The air between them thickened, tension crackling like static electricity. Shaq glanced around, noticing a few people had stopped to watch. Phones emerged, cameras trained on the unfolding scene. The crowd was small but growing, whispers cutting through the cold night air. "I don't want any trouble, officer," Shaq said, taking a step back. "You don't want trouble," Carter echoed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He took a step forward, closing the distance. "Then explain how you got that chain, and don't give me any of that artist nonsense." Shaq took a deep breath. He had faced bullies before, men who mistook his quiet strength for weakness. He had risen above them every time. "I don't owe you an explanation," he said, his voice low but firm. I haven't done anything wrong. Carter's face darkened. The power he felt slipping from his grasp ignited a spark of rage. Without warning, he reached out and grabbed the chain, yanking it hard. The clasp broke, and the chain fell to the ground with a metallic clatter. The act was deliberate, a show of dominance meant to humiliate. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Shaq froze, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The chain glinted on the pavement, a symbol of his pride now lying in the dirt. Carter bent down, picked it up, and dangled it in front of him like a trophy. Not so tough now, are you? Carter sneered. The crowd murmured, their whispers growing louder. Phones were raised higher, their lenses capturing every second. Shaq could feel the weight of their eyes, their anticipation. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was a moment that would echo far beyond this cold London street. He straightened his back, his gaze locking onto Carter's. "Give me back my chain," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. Carter smirked, twirling the chain in his hand. "You think you can talk to me like that? I'm the law." "No," Shaq said, stepping closer. His voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "You're a man who's forgotten what the law stands for." The crowd erupted into cheers and shouts of support. Carter's smirk faltered, the weight of the situation finally sinking in. But Shaq wasn't done. He took another step forward, his eyes blazing with determination. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice rising. "This is about everyone who's ever been judged, humiliated, or broken because of people like you. You thought you could rip this chain off and silence me, but you've only made my voice louder." Carter took a step back, the chain slipping from his fingers. The crowd surged forward, their voices a crescendo of unity and defiance. Shaq bent down, picked up the chain, and held it high. "This is more than gold," he said, his voice carrying over the noise. "It's a symbol, and tonight, it's a reminder that we will not be silenced." The crowd roared, their cheers echoing through the night. Carter looked around, his face pale, and his authority shattered. For the first time, he realized that he was no longer in control. This was just the beginning. The ripples of resistance. By the next morning, the video had already gone viral. It had started as a shaky, grainy clip uploaded to social media, but its content struck a nerve. Millions of people watched as a white officer ripped the chain from the neck of one of London's most beloved artists, his voice dripping with scorn and prejudice. The sight of Marcus "Big Shaq" Duval standing tall, reclaiming his dignity in front of a growing crowd, resonated far beyond the streets of London. The hashtags started almost immediately. #JusticeForShaq, #StandForDignity, and #EnoughIsEnough. Each tag carried a weight of stories untold, people who had faced their own moments of injustice, humiliation, or abuse, but lacked the platform to fight back. Now, Shaq's battle had become theirs, and the collective voice demanded action. In the aftermath, Shaq sat in his flat, scrolling through the endless stream of notifications on his phone. Every platform was ablaze: Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. Celebrities, fans, and activists were sharing the video, each post amplifying the story further. Even major news outlets had picked it up, dissecting every frame of the footage. Anchors debated the systemic issues it highlighted while pundits argued over the deeper implications. Despite the whirlwind outside, Shaq felt oddly calm. His gold chain, now repaired, hung around his neck once more. He stared at it, his fingers tracing its links. The chain wasn't just jewelry. It was a symbol of his survival, a piece of his soul forged from years of struggle and success. Carter's act wasn't just an attack on him. It was an attack on what he stood for. A knock at the door broke his reverie. Shaq opened it to find his manager, Greg, standing there, his face a mixture of concern and urgency. "Shaq, mate, it's a madhouse out there," Greg said, stepping inside. He carried a tablet loaded with more notifications and news updates. "Everyone's talking about this. We've had press inquiries, interview requests, even offers to sponsor a statement." Shaq sighed, running a hand through his short cropped hair. "It's not about sponsorships or interviews, Greg. This is bigger than me." Greg nodded, his expression softening. "I know, but you need to decide how you want to handle this. The world is watching, and you have the platform to make real change." Shaq leaned against the counter, his mind racing. The words of his late mother echoed in his ears. "Never waste your pain, Marcus. Let it teach, let it inspire, but never let it silence you." He turned to Greg, his resolve hardening. "Then let's make them listen." The public rally. A week later, Shaq stood on the steps of London City Hall. A massive crowd stretched as far as the eye could see, their chants and cheers reverberating through the crisp winter air. Protest signs bobbed above the sea of heads, bearing messages like "dignity for all" and "justice is not optional." The energy was electric, a powerful mix of outrage and hope. Shaq adjusted the microphone in front of him, the gold chain glinting against his dark hoodie. He took a deep breath, scanning the faces in the crowd. Some were fans, others activists, but all were united by a shared demand for change. "When I was stopped that night," Shaq began, his deep voice carrying over the noise, "it wasn't the first time I faced prejudice, and it won't be the last. But this time, the world saw it. This time, we have a chance to make sure it's the last time for someone else." The crowd erupted into applause, their voices surging like a tidal wave. Shaq let the noise wash over him before continuing. "This chain," he said, holding it up, "isn't just gold. It's my story. It's every hour I spent perfecting my craft, every obstacle I overcame, and every dream I refused to give up on. And that night, someone tried to rip it away, not just the chain, but what it represents." He paused, his gaze steady. "But they didn't succeed. They can't succeed, because what they don't understand is that our stories, our dignity, and our strength can't be taken away. They're ours, and it's time we make sure the world knows it." The crowd roared, their cheers echoing across the city. Cameras flashed, and live streams beamed his words to millions watching around the world. Shaq felt the weight of the moment, but he also felt the strength of the people standing with him, behind the badge. Meanwhile, Officer Carter sat in a small, sterile room at the police station, his hands clasped tightly on the table in front of him. The disciplinary hearing was in full swing, and the atmosphere was tense. Across from him sat a panel of senior officers and legal representatives, their expressions grim. "This department does not condone the actions displayed in the video," one of the officers said, her voice clipped. "Officer Carter, your behavior was unacceptable and has brought disrepute to the entire force." Carter's face was pale, beads of sweat dotting his forehead. He opened his mouth to speak, but the panel chair raised a hand to silence him. "You will have a chance to respond," she said firmly. "But first, we need to address the larger issue at hand." Outside the station, another crowd had gathered. Protesters held signs demanding Carter's dismissal, their voices mingling with the chants from Shaq's rally across the city. The pressure on the police force was immense, with calls for systemic reform growing louder by the hour. Carter shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had spent years patrolling these streets, but never had he felt so powerless. The authority he had wielded with such confidence now felt like a distant memory, a system on trial. Shaq's fight wasn't just about one man's actions. It was about the system that allowed those actions to occur. As public outrage grew, so did calls for change. Activists demanded mandatory training on racial bias, independent oversight of police conduct, and greater accountability for officers who abused their power. Shaq partnered with civil rights organizations, using his platform to amplify their voices. He attended meetings with lawmakers, gave interviews to major networks, and even testified before Parliament. Each step was a reminder that this wasn't just a personal battle. It was a fight for justice that encompassed countless stories like his. The turning point. 2 weeks after the incident, a televised debate was held, featuring Shaq, legal experts, and representatives from the police force. The footage of the confrontation played on a screen behind them, a stark reminder of the stakes. "This isn't about one bad apple," Shaq said, his voice steady but passionate. "This is about a culture that allows power to be abused. It's about a society where people are judged not by their actions but by their appearances. That's what needs to change." The audience erupted into applause, and the debate became a rallying cry for systemic reform. The momentum was undeniable. The chain unbroken. As the weeks turned into months, tangible change began to take shape. The officer responsible was dismissed and faced legal consequences, while the department implemented new policies to address systemic issues. But for Shaq, the fight was far from over. He launched the Chain Unbroken Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting victims of injustice and promoting equality. The foundation provided legal aid, funded community programs, and worked to dismantle the prejudices that fueled moments like the one he had endured. At the foundation's launch event, Shaq stood before a crowd once more, the gold chain around his neck. He smiled, his voice filled with hope and determination. "This chain was ripped from me once," he said, "but it's back where it belongs. And as long as it's here, I'll keep fighting. For me, for you, for everyone." The crowd cheered, their voices carrying the promise of a brighter future. The sparks of revolution. The months following the incident marked the beginning of a seismic shift. Big Shaq's voice had become a rallying cry, echoing across the streets, through the airwaves, and into the hearts of millions. What had started as a single act of defiance, a refusal to be humiliated, was now a movement. But with momentum came resistance, and Shaq knew the road ahead would not be smooth. The heat of backlash. Not everyone was in support of Shaq's cause. For every post lauding his bravery, there was another accusing him of playing the victim, exploiting the situation, or being a symbol of divisiveness. Conservative talk shows debated the overreaction to a simple misunderstanding. Online trolls filled comment sections with vitriol, their anonymity emboldening their hate. Despite the negativity, Shaq remained unshaken. His resolve was rooted in something deeper than public opinion. Every insult hurled his way only reinforced the need for change. Still, the backlash wasn't limited to online spaces. Shaq began receiving veiled threats in the mail, and his concerts became flashpoints for protest. At a press conference, a journalist bluntly asked, "Do you think your actions are causing unnecessary tension in the community?" Shaq looked the journalist in the eye, his expression unwavering. "Tension has always existed," he replied. "What's different now is that it's no longer hidden. You can't fix what you refuse to see." Carter's legal battle. While Shaq continued to galvanize support, Officer Carter found himself in the eye of a storm. The disciplinary actions against him were just the beginning. Civil rights organizations pushed for criminal charges, arguing that his actions were emblematic of abuse of power and racial bias. Public outcry pressured the justice system to act, and soon, Carter was facing trial. The courtroom was packed during the proceedings, reporters and spectators jostling for space. The prosecutor laid out a damning case, using the viral video as the cornerstone of their argument. Expert witnesses testified about the systemic nature of such incidents, framing Carter's actions as part of a broader issue. Carter's defense lawyer painted a very different picture. They argued that Carter had acted within the bounds of his authority, and that his actions had been misinterpreted in the heat of the moment. "He didn't know who Marcus Duval was," the lawyer said, emphasizing the lack of premeditation. Shaq attended the trial silently, sitting among the crowd. His presence was a statement in itself, a reminder that this wasn't just about one man, but about everyone who had ever been silenced or overlooked. Building bridges and breaking barriers. While the legal battle raged on, Shaq focused on expanding his foundation's efforts. The Chain Unbroken Foundation quickly became a beacon of hope, offering scholarships to underprivileged youth, funding community mentorship programs, and organizing workshops on implicit bias for law enforcement agencies. One of the foundation's first major events was a summit held in the heart of London. Leaders from various sectors, politics, entertainment, education, and law enforcement, came together to discuss solutions. The room was a blend of perspectives, some aligned with Shaq's vision, and others staunchly opposed. Shaq opened the summit with a powerful address. "Real change isn't comfortable," he said, his voice steady but impassioned. "It requires us to confront the parts of ourselves and our systems that we'd rather ignore. But discomfort is a small price to pay for progress." The summit culminated in the creation of the Dignity Pact, a collaborative agreement outlining actionable steps to address systemic inequality. While some attendees signed eagerly, others hesitated, their reluctance a stark reminder of the challenges ahead. The personal toll. Behind the scenes, the weight of Shaq's newfound role as a movement leader was taking its toll. His schedule was relentless. Meetings, interviews, rallies, and the pressure was unyielding. At night, he would sit alone in his flat, staring at the city lights, wondering if he was truly making a difference or merely adding his voice to the cacophony. One evening, his best friend, Tyrell, dropped by unannounced. Tyrell had known Shaq since their days of freestyling on street corners, long before fame had found him. "Man, you look like you're carrying the world on your shoulders," Tyrell said, plopping down on the couch. "When's the last time you took a break?" Shaq managed a small smile. "Can't afford to stop now. Too many people counting on me." Tyrell leaned forward, his expression serious. "You've always been a fighter, Shaq. But even fighters need to rest. You can't pour from an empty cup, bro." The words lingered in Shaq's mind long after Tyrell left. He realized that while the fight was important, so was his ability to sustain it. The next day, he delegated more responsibilities within the foundation and set aside time to reconnect with his music, a part of himself that had been overshadowed by the movement. The verdict. Months after the incident, the courtroom was packed once more as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict in Carter's case. The air was thick with anticipation, every creak of a bench or shuffle of papers amplifying the tension. "The court finds the defendant, Officer James Carter, guilty of misconduct and abuse of authority," the judge announced. A collective gasp filled the room, followed by murmurs of approval from those who had hoped for accountability. While the sentence wasn't as severe as some had wanted, it was a milestone. A rare instance of an officer being held accountable in a high-profile case. Outside the courthouse, supporters gathered, their chants echoing through the streets. Shaq emerged from the building, flanked by his team. Cameras flashed, and microphones were thrust in his direction. He paused, looking directly at the crowd of reporters. "This verdict is a step in the right direction," he said, his voice measured. "But one case doesn't fix a broken system. This isn't the end of the fight. It's the beginning." The cultural shift. The incident and its aftermath sparked widespread reflection. Schools introduced curriculum changes to teach students about systemic inequality. Corporations implemented diversity training programs. Even the police force, under immense public pressure, launched reforms, including body cameras and mandatory training on racial bias. Shaq's story became a case study, his name synonymous with resilience and change. But for Shaq, the most rewarding moments came in quieter settings. Letters from young fans inspired by his journey, or conversations with parents who saw him as a role model for their children. A night to remember. Months after the trial, Shaq performed at a benefit concert for the foundation. The venue was packed, the energy palpable. As he stepped onto the stage, the crowd erupted into cheers. He held up the gold chain, its links gleaming under the stage lights. "This chain," he said, his voice amplified across the venue, "was ripped from me in an attempt to take away my dignity." But what they didn't understand is that dignity isn't in the gold. It's in the fight. And as long as I have breath, I'll keep fighting. Not just for me, but for all of us. The crowd roared, their voices a testament to the unity and determination that Shaq had ignited. As the music began and as Shaq's lyrics filled the air, it was clear that his journey, while far from over, had already left an indelible mark on the world. Chains of change. The weeks following Officer Carter's guilty verdict marked a turning point, but Marcus "Big Shaq" Duval knew this was no victory lap. The fire ignited by his stand burned brightly, but sustaining a movement meant stoking those flames, not letting them sputter out. Change wasn't a single event. It was a chain reaction, and Shaq intended to keep adding links. A divided public. Shaq's name had become a lightning rod. Across the globe, people rallied around his story, drawing parallels to their own struggles. His face graced the covers of magazines, his interviews were streamed millions of times, and his name was chanted at protests. Yet, just as many viewed him with disdain. Conservative commentators dismissed him as a media darling exploiting his fame, and online forums buzzed with attempts to discredit him. One particularly vicious article accused him of fabricating his story, claiming that his rise to fame had shielded him from real struggles. The piece went viral, fueling the wave of skeptics. Shaq's team advised him to ignore it, but he felt compelled to respond. In a raw, unfiltered livestream, Shaq sat in his studio, the gold chain hanging visibly around his neck. "For those who think this is about attention," he said, his voice steady but sharp, "understand this. I didn't ask for that night to happen. I didn't ask to have my dignity ripped from me in the middle of a street. But it did happen, and now I'm making sure it doesn't happen to someone else." The video garnered millions of views, and the hashtag #ChainSoFChange began trending worldwide, turning the smear campaign into yet another catalyst for the movement. A seat at the table. One of the most significant outcomes of the public outcry was the invitation Shaq received to join a national commission on policing reform. The commission, comprised of activists, legal experts, and community leaders, was tasked with recommending sweeping changes to law enforcement practices across the UK. Shaq hesitated before accepting. He wasn't a politician or a lawyer. He was an artist, a storyteller. What could he contribute to a room full of experts? "You're the voice they need to hear," his manager Greg told him. "They need someone who's lived it, not just studied it." Shaq agreed, and his presence on the commission sent shockwaves through traditional circles. Many saw him as an outsider, someone too emotional or inexperienced to contribute meaningfully. But Shaq didn't let the skepticism deter him. During the commission's first meeting, Shaq spoke passionately about his experience and its broader implications. "This isn't just about training officers to avoid bad behavior," he said. "It's about changing the culture that allows it to happen in the first place. That's a harder fight, but it's the only one worth having." His words resonated, even with those who had doubted him. Over time, Shaq's insights helped shape proposals for mandatory bias training, community oversight boards, and stricter accountability measures for officers who abused their power. Personal struggles and private moments. While Shaq publicly championed change, he wrestled with his own inner turmoil. The relentless pace of activism left him drained, and the weight of being a symbol took a toll on his personal relationships. His girlfriend, Layla, often found herself competing with the movement for his attention. One evening, as they sat in their living room, Layla finally spoke up. "Shaq, I'm proud of what you're doing, but I miss us. I miss you." Shaq sighed, leaning back against the couch. "I know, Layla. It's just, there's so much to do. Every time I think about slowing down, I see another story, another person going through what I went through." She placed a hand on his. "I get that. But if you burn out, who's going to lead this fight? You have to take care of yourself, too." Her words lingered with Shaq. He realized that being a leader didn't mean sacrificing himself entirely. Over the next few weeks, he made a conscious effort to balance his personal life with his public mission. He and Layla began setting aside regular time for themselves, and Shaq found moments of peace in the simple act of being present. Carter speaks out. Months after his conviction, Officer Carter broke his silence in an exclusive interview. The disgraced officer, no longer in uniform, looked visibly aged, his once confident demeanor replaced by a subdued tone. I didn't think it would go this far, Carter said, his voice trembling slightly. I made a mistake, a big one. But the world painted me as a monster. When asked why he had acted the way he did that night, Carter paused before responding. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe it was bias I didn't realize I had. Maybe it was the way I was trained. All I know is I ruined my life and hurt someone who didn't deserve it. The interview sparked mixed reactions. Some saw it as an attempt at redemption, while others viewed it as a self-serving bid for sympathy. Shaq, watching the interview with Layla, felt a complicated mix of emotions. What do you think? Layla asked. Shaq shook his head. I think he's still trying to figure it out, and that's part of the problem. The Foundation's first victory. The Chain Unbroken Foundation achieved its first major victory when it successfully lobbied for new legislation requiring independent investigations into police misconduct. The law, dubbed the Shaq Act by the media, was celebrated as a significant step toward accountability. At a press conference announcing the law's passage, Shaq spoke to a crowd of supporters and reporters. This isn't just a win for me, he said. It's a win for every person who's ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. But it's also just the beginning. There's more work to be done. The Foundation's success inspired similar efforts in other countries. Activists from the United States to South Africa reached out to Shaq, seeking advice on how to replicate his model. The movement had gone global, and Shaq found himself at the forefront of an international push for justice. A night of reflection. 1 year after the incident, Shaq returned to the street where it all began. The neighborhood looked the same, but Shaq felt different. He stood under the same dim streetlight where his chain had fallen to the pavement, the memories of that night flooding back. He held the gold chain in his hands, its weight a reminder of the journey he had traveled. He thought about the people who had supported him, the changes that had been made, and the battle still ahead. A group of young kids passed by, their laughter breaking the silence. One of them recognized him and stopped. You're Big Shaq, right? The boy asked, his eyes wide. Shaq nodded, a small smile on his lips. Yeah, that's me. The boy grinned. You're a legend, man. My dad says you changed everything. Shaq chuckled, ruffling the boy's hair. Nah, kid, I didn't change everything. But I hope I helped start something. As the kids ran off, Shaq looked up at the night sky, his breath visible in the cold air. He felt a sense of peace, knowing that while the fight for justice was far from over, the chains of change were stronger than ever. The unyielding flame. The second year following the incident was a whirlwind for Marcus Big Shaq Duval. The movement sparked that fateful night had evolved into something far greater than he could have imagined. Yet as the embers of the initial outrage began to cool, Shaq realized that the true challenge was just beginning, sustaining momentum when the world's attention shifted elsewhere. The weight of leadership. Big Shaq had gone from being an artist to a full-fledged activist and symbol of resistance. His days were consumed by meetings with lawmakers, interviews with global media outlets, and events hosted by his foundation. At night, he would return home to his London flat, exhausted but unable to rest. His mind raced with thoughts of what still needed to be done. Reforms that hadn't passed, stories of injustice that remained unheard, and the faces of those who had written to him seeking hope. Despite his efforts to balance his public mission with his personal life, the strain was evident. His girlfriend, Layla, noticed how he sometimes drifted during conversations, his eyes clouded by the weight of the world. One evening, she sat him down in their small kitchen, the aroma of fresh tea filling the air. "Shaq, I know you're doing something incredible," she said softly, "but you're carrying too much on your own. You have a team, a movement. Trust them. Let them share the burden." Shaq nodded, taking her hand. "I hear you, Layla. It's just, every time I try to step back, I feel like I'm letting someone down." "You're human," she replied, her voice steady but warm. "Even heroes need help." Her words struck a chord. Over the following weeks, Shaq began delegating more responsibilities to his foundation's leadership team. He focused on where his voice could make the biggest impact: on stage, in front of cameras, and in the hearts of people who needed inspiration. Global ripples. The story of Big Shaq had transcended borders. Movements inspired by his stand erupted in cities across the globe. In the United States, activists cited Shaq's campaign during protests demanding police reform in cities like Minneapolis and Atlanta. In South Africa, youth movements echoed his call for dignity and equality. Even in parts of Asia and Europe, his name became synonymous with resilience and justice. Shaq began traveling internationally, attending rallies and speaking at conferences. One such event brought him to Johannesburg, South Africa, where he addressed a massive crowd gathered in front of the iconic Nelson Mandela Bridge. Standing on a raised platform, Shaq looked out at the sea of faces, each one filled with anticipation. "I've learned something powerful over the past 2 years," he began, his voice amplified across the crowd. "Injustice may wear different faces in different places, but the pain it causes is universal. And so is the strength to fight it." The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy fueling Shaq's resolve. "They can try to silence us, divide us, or break us," he continued, "but they'll never win. Because what they don't understand is this: when you stand for dignity, you stand for something they can't take away." Carter's attempt at redemption. Back in London, Officer James Carter's life had taken a dramatic turn. Disgraced and unemployed, he had spent the better part of 2 years in isolation, reflecting on his actions. The backlash from the public, the trial, and the loss of his career had forced him to confront truths he had long ignored. Carter reached out to the Chain Unbroken Foundation, requesting a meeting with Shaq. Initially, Shaq was hesitant. "Why should I give him my time?" he asked Greg during a late-night call. Greg's response was measured. "Because it's not about him, Shaq. It's about what his story can teach. If he's genuinely seeking redemption, this could be an opportunity." Reluctantly, Shaq agreed. They met in a private room at the foundation's headquarters. Carter looked different. His uniform replaced by a plain shirt and jeans, his demeanor subdued. "I wanted to apologize to you directly," Carter began, his voice strained. "I know my words can't undo what I did, but I've spent the past 2 years trying to understand why I acted the way I did." Shaq studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. "And have you figured it out?" Carter nodded slowly. "It was bias. It was ignorance. And it was the arrogance of believing that a badge made me untouchable. I let the system shape me into something I'm ashamed of." The room was silent for a moment before Shaq spoke. "Apology accepted," he said, his tone measured. "But redemption isn't about words. It's about actions." Carter nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. "I want to help. If there's any way I can use my story to prevent others from making the same mistakes, I'm willing to do it." Shaq agreed to involve Carter in workshops run by the foundation, where he shared his journey with law enforcement recruits. It wasn't an easy decision, but Shaq saw it as a step toward transforming pain into progress. The next wave of challenges. As the movement grew, so did resistance from those invested in maintaining the status quo. Political figures began framing the push for reform as an attack on law and order. False narratives spread online, claiming Shaq's foundation was secretly funded by extremist groups. Protesters supporting the movement were met with counter-demonstrators, and tensions occasionally escalated into violence. One night, during a peaceful rally in Manchester, clashes broke out between protesters and an opposing group. Shaq, who had been speaking at the event, witnessed the chaos unfold from the stage. He quickly grabbed the microphone. "Stop," he shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. "This is not what we stand for." The crowd stilled, eyes turning to him. "Our fight is for dignity, justice, and unity, not division," he continued. "Don't let anger consume what we've built. Let's show them our strength lies in peace." His words calmed the crowd, and the rally resumed without further incident. The moment was widely covered in the media, earning Shaq praise for his leadership. A legacy takes shape. As the second anniversary of the incident approached, Shaq's team planned a massive event to commemorate the progress made and reignite the movement's energy. Held at Wembley Stadium, the Chains of Change Summit featured performances, speeches, and panels with global leaders and activists. Shaq closed the event with a heartfelt speech. Standing on the stage, the gold chain glinting under the spotlights, he reflected on the journey so far. "This chain," he said, holding it up, "was once a symbol of what I'd achieved. Now, it's a reminder of what we've all built together. 2 years ago, they tried to take my dignity. Today, we've shown the world that dignity can't be stolen. It's something we carry in our hearts, and when we share it, it only grows stronger." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the stadium. As Shaq looked out at the thousands of faces before him, he felt a profound sense of purpose. The movement was no longer just about him. It was a collective fight for a better, more just world. And it was far from over. A legacy forged in gold. 2 years and countless battles later, Marcus "Big Shaq" Duval stood at the crossroads of a movement that had transformed his life and the lives of millions. What had started as a single act of defiance had grown into an international revolution, but Shaq knew that every movement reached a tipping point. The question wasn't whether change would come, but whether it would last. The tide turns. The momentum generated by the chain unbroken foundation continued to ripple across the globe. Governments, institutions, and communities began adopting policies inspired by the work Shaq had spearheaded. Independent oversight bodies for police conduct were introduced in countries as far-flung as Brazil and Australia. Social media platforms partnered with activist groups to combat online hate speech. Yet, resistance remained. Pockets of the old guard clung to their power, pushing back against reforms that threatened to unravel deeply ingrained systems. In some places, protesters were met with heightened aggression. In others, legislation stalled in bureaucratic red tape. Shaq had seen it all before. He'd learned that progress was never linear. It was a battle of persistence, and persistence was something he had in abundance. The personal cost. Despite his public success, Shaq found himself grappling with the toll of his new reality. The pressures of leadership, the constant media scrutiny, and the weight of representing so many voices began to erode his sense of self. The studio, once his sanctuary, now felt like a distant memory. His guitar sat untouched, and the mic he poured his heart into was gathering dust. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of meetings and interviews, Shaq found himself standing on the balcony of his flat, staring out at the sprawling city. London's lights blinked back at him, a living, breathing organism that never truly slept. He thought of his mother's words, "Never waste your pain, Marcus. Let it inspire, but never let it consume you." Behind him, Layla approached, her presence grounding him. She wrapped her arms around his waist and rested her head against his back. "You're doing amazing things," she said softly, as if sensing the turmoil in his mind. "But you need to find a way to bring Marcus back into Big Shaq." Her words stayed with him. The next morning, he picked up his guitar for the first time in months. The notes felt foreign under his fingers at first, but soon, the music began to flow. For Shaq, it wasn't just about the music, it was about reconnecting with himself. Slowly, the artist in him began to re-emerge, intertwined with the activist he had become. The turning point. In the summer of the 3rd year after the incident, Shaq received an invitation to speak at the United Nations. The UN had organized a global summit on systemic inequality, and Shaq's work was recognized as a blueprint for change. The General Assembly Hall was an imposing space, filled with delegates from nearly every nation. Shaq stood at the podium, the weight of the moment pressing against his chest. But as he looked out over the sea of faces, he felt a calm determination. "I stand before you not as a politician or an expert," he began, his voice steady, "but as a man who lived through what so many others have experienced in silence, What happened to me was not unique. It was a symptom of a deeper illness that we all have a responsibility to address. He paused, holding up the gold chain that had become a symbol of the movement. This chain was meant to be a reminder of where I came from. But when it was ripped from me, it became something else. It became a symbol of resilience, of unity, and of the unyielding power of dignity. Shaq's speech was met with a standing ovation. But more importantly, it resulted in a series of commitments from member states to implement policies addressing systemic discrimination. A new generation. One of Shaq's proudest achievements came not from the policies he influenced, but from the people he inspired. Young leaders emerged from the movement, taking the torch and carrying it into their communities. In London, a teenager named Amara started a youth initiative called Voices Rising, which provided platforms for young people to speak out against injustice. In the United States, a college student named Jaden organized a nationwide campaign to reform university policing policies. Stories like theirs poured in from around the world, each one a testament to the movement's impact. Shaq made it a point to meet these young leaders whenever he could. At a gathering in Manchester, he stood in a circle with a group of teenagers who had started their own grassroots campaigns. "You're the future," he told them, his voice filled with pride. "This movement isn't about one person. It's about all of us. And seeing what you've built, it reminds me that we're just getting started." The night of triumph. As the third anniversary of the incident approached, Shaq and his team organized a global event, the Chains of Change Festival, held simultaneously in cities across the world. In London, the main stage was set up at Hyde Park, where thousands gathered to celebrate how far they'd come and to renew their commitment to the road ahead. Shaq stood backstage, the roar of the crowd vibrating through the air. Layla was by his side, as always, her steady presence calming him. Greg handed him a mic and smiled. "Time to remind them why they follow you." As Shaq stepped onto the stage, the crowd erupted into cheers. He raised his hand for silence, and the sea of voices quieted. 3 years ago, he began, his voice carrying across the park. "I stood on a street corner, humiliated but unbroken. What they tried to take from me that night wasn't just a chain. It was my dignity, my humanity, my voice." He held up the gold chain, its links gleaming under the lights. But what they didn't realize is that our dignity can't be stolen. Our humanity can't be silenced. And our voices, they're louder than ever. The crowd erupted, their cheers a thunderous wave of solidarity. "This chain," Shaq continued, "is no longer just mine. It belongs to all of us, to everyone who has ever been told they don't matter, to everyone who has ever fought back against injustice. Together, we've turned pain into power, and tonight, we celebrate that." The festival ended with a performance by Shaq, his first full set in years. As his music filled the air, it was clear that Marcus Duval, the artist, and Big Shaq, the activist, had become one. A legacy beyond the chain. As the years passed, the movement Shaq had sparked continued to grow. The Chain Unbroken Foundation expanded its reach, partnering with organizations worldwide. Shaq himself became a global ambassador for dignity and equality, his story taught in classrooms and featured in documentaries. But for Shaq, his proudest moments came in quieter settings. Meeting a young boy in Kenya wearing a t-shirt with his name on it, receiving a letter from a woman in Brazil who credited him with saving her son's life, or simply walking through London and seeing the diversity of his city thriving in ways he had once only dreamed of. One evening, as he stood on his balcony with Layla, gazing at the city that had shaped him, Shaq felt a deep sense of peace. The gold chain hung around his neck, no longer just a reminder of his past, but a symbol of the legacy he had built. "Do you think we did enough?" he asked softly. Layla smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "We didn't just do enough, Shaq. We did everything." And as the city lights blinked back at him, Shaq knew that the chains of change he had forged would endure long after he was gone.